Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. It's Ancient History Day today. And Lena, who have you gone and found for us today?
We've got with us Chris Davies, who is a historian and MA Classical student at the Open University, and he really loves the Fishbourne Palace, and he is here to talk about exactly that. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Boom, this is my childhood. I love Fishbourne Roman Palace. It's epic. If you haven't been and you haven't taken your children and you live, I don't know, south of Watford, then be ashamed because it is magnificent, isn't it, Chris?
It is, absolutely. It's an amazing site, and what they've actually managed to do with it as well, considering what they had to work with. It's absolutely phenomenal. And the history of the place and everything that goes with it, it's, well, as Lena pointed out, I do love the place. So,
First of all, can you tell us what the Fishbourne Palace is?
Okay, well, rather obviously, it's a palace located near the village of Fishbourne in West Sussex. What's more unique about it, this is the largest Roman palace found in Britain, and it's the largest Roman residence that's actually been found north of the Alps. And to put into perspective the size of it, it's similar in size to Nero's Golden House, and the entire site is larger than Buckingham Palace, with a layout similar to Domitian's palace, the Domus Flavia.
That's amazing. Do you know who it's built for? And do we know when it was built?
Well, so it was built following earlier designs. So previously it was the site was used for granaries. I believe most likely part of the expanding supply lines for the legions as they pushed into Britain during the Claudian invasion around about 43 CE. Later on, two timber residences were built, which were offering some comfort, evidence that these early structures had clay and mortar flooring, for instance, plastered walls. So not necessarily permanent, but enough to sort of indicate somebody important was there. This was followed in 65 CE with a proto-palace, a sort of an earlier, smaller palace. It's a similar design to one that was discovered in Angmering in West Sussex, which suggests that there were several nobles living in the area. And around about 75 to 80 CE, the full-scale palace was built, which incorporated the proto-palace in the southeast corner. So it'd been built slowly over time. The site had been developed as the importance grew and the focus from invasion turned into more governing and occupation. Who it was built for is a very interesting question. The size and the opulence of the palace, what we found, it suggests to us that it was built for somebody of great importance. As I say, we're talking about a site that was similar in size to Nero's Golden House or Domitian's palace, the Domus Flavia, bigger than Buckingham Palace. You're talking somebody of great importance must have lived there. But we don't actually know for certain who, which it adds to the mystery of the site, really. It's one that's more common belief put forward by Professor Barry Cunliffe, who led the team that excavated the site, was that it was built for a British king called Toggy or Coggy Dubnus, with some discussion as to whether it's a T or a C. And it's mainly put this way because we know that he was in favour of the Romans. The historian Tacitus, in his book about his father-in-law Agricola, states about Togydubnus that certain states were given to him as he'd remained faithful down to our own times, in accordance with an old and accepted Roman tradition of using the kings as instruments of subjugating their own people. And it's possible that Togydubnus may have been brought up in Rome, which would indicate where this loyalty had come from. We know after Julius Caesar that it had been established, there was lines of communication, some trade most likely happened between Roman Gaul and Britain. And early on, around about 40 CE period, Verica, Togydubnus' father possibly, he was overthrown, and he was a friend of Rome. And it's believed that Togydubnus and Verica may have petitioned to Rome for aid in restoring back the land. which provided Rome with the convenient excuse they needed to gain another province for the empire, as if they needed much of an excuse at the time. So one theory is that it was built for Verica or by Verica, though if he was elderly at the time, around about 43 CE when Claudian invasion was going on, 75 to 80 CE, unlikely he would have survived that, which is probably the reason why they put more on Togedabnus. And if the palace was built for him, he must have been very well regarded. As I say, you're talking about such a large and opulent site. We know he was active in the region from inscriptions that were found in the nearby city of Chichester. One particular commonly referred to as Roman inscription of Britain 91 or RIB 91, which states that he had given up a temple. Effectively, he'd had part of the commissioning of a temple. But if it wasn't him, then perhaps an owner was the governor who, after Agricola, governed Britain, called Sallustius Lucullus. However, despite being the son of a British prince, Adaminius, he's identified as being in the area by the similar inscriptions found in Chichester, but Suetonius records that Sallustius was executed around 93 CE. So if he was the person who the palace was built for, he didn't occupy it for an extensive period of time. And one other one that's put forward is a Tiberius Claudius Catullus, who is identified as a possibility when his gold signet ring was discovered close to the site around about 1995.
So talk to us about this layout, because from what I'm getting, it is incredibly, incredibly huge.
So yeah, it's one hell of a site. I mean, what exists now is part of the garden, and they've sort of covered over the northern end of the palace. A lot of what exists now is taken up by private housing, unfortunately. But the layout itself was 4 wings, a large central garden, and the garden was surrounded by colonnades, which created a peristyle, which is a continuous porch formed by rows of columns surrounding a courtyard or the perimeter of a building. It was, as I say, magnificently decorated. There was the mosaics, of course, but they also had underfloor heating and internal bathhouse. And the central gardens themselves are the earliest ever discovered in Britain, with shaped beds for hedges, trees, foundations with water supplied through ceramic piping. This isn't the sort of thing you'd do for your bog standard housing. So again, we know that whoever owned this was considered important. The gardens in particular, has been a lot of work to try to create what's available of it and how it would have looked. We have no evidence of what would have been grown there, but they've looked to the writings such as those of Pliny the Younger, who did give us great descriptions of his own gardens. So they've built up a reconstruction of this, and in 1995 they opened up a Roman Gardens museum on the site as well. But back to the actual thing, so the north and east wings would have had a series of buildings that were built around their own little courtyards, with a large entrance built into the east wing and a large aisled assembly hall in the northeast corner. There was a gallery in the west wing with a large reception room, which was likely used for ceremonial purposes, as well as a series of staterooms. And the south wing possibly had the owner's private quarters, but the most elaborate mosaics located in the north wing.
Can you tell us, how long was this site lost for? When was it found, and how did we stumble across it?
The site itself was found around about 1960. It was found in 1960, sorry, and purely by accident. Aubrey Barrett, who was an engineer working for Portsmouth Water, was digging a new water main in a field near the village, and he'd uncovered several artifacts, and noticeably mosaics and parts of a wall. And he realised the importance of what he'd found, so he stopped digging and let various organisations know, as was kind of the practice back then when they discovered something. And the local civic society began excavations 1961, led by archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, or Professor Cunliffe, using a team of what would have been at the time amateur archaeologists. Professional archaeology hadn't really taken hold in the UK. There was a couple of organisations and steps were being taken. So when we refer to them as amateur archaeologists, it's not so much that they were stumbling in the dark, as opposed to they just wouldn't have necessarily had the formal qualifications that would be expected by modern archaeologists. For how long it had been lost, the palace itself had burnt down around about 270 CE, so about 270, 280 CE. So in theory, it had been lost since then. We have no previous knowledge of it up until about 1960.
It's mad, isn't it? It was just there under the surface the whole time and nobody knew.
Well, that's it. There's this opulent, large palace, as I say, the largest north of the Alps, and we'd lost it. It had been forgotten about. I mean, whatever remained from the fire had probably been plundered, as much of the ancient sites were for building materials. But yeah, outside of that, it's for all intents and purposes vanished.
I find that really interesting, how just randomly you can stumble across things. As the same way they did with Pompeii, really. They just randomly dug a hole and, oh, wow, look, okay, there's some ancient archaeological stuff under there.
I mean, that's it, especially when you look at how notable the Romans are for their recording of things. I mean, they noted down every detail of their lives almost. We know so much from what little writing we have. And yet, like you say, places can just vanish, never to be found again in some cases, or eventually because some guy was digging for laying water mains. It is bizarre.
Okay, so some artefacts must have been found in this extravagant and beautiful palace. So what artefacts were found by archaeologists when they did the excavations?
Apart from the previously mentioned gold ring, there's been various items associated with the Romans, obviously, notably building materials. So we found like tiles, things like that. Probably one of the more interesting ones was from a tibia bone that was unearthed in 1964. But in 2017, this was identified as a rabbit bone. And radiocarbon dating carried out on the bone, with modern technologies allowing us to discover so much more now. And it revealed to us that rabbits, which are native to France and Spain, had arrived in Britain more than a millennia earlier than what we previously thought. These remains, they showed no signs of butchering and suggest that they may have been kept as part of like a mini zoo, an exotic menagerie of animals. And it might seem like a small discovery, you know, so rabbits were here 1,000 years earlier than we previously considered, but it indicates just how much modern research and technology given us much greater understanding of the past.
You say that it's nothing, but I guarantee you that this is our like fourth podcast today, and the 2,000-year-old bunny is the most exciting thing so far. I love it.
Well,
that's epic. A bunny that's over 2,000 years old.
Yeah, and even more than that, a small bone of a rabbit has revealed so much more about our history than we previously thought. You know, like originally it was thought that the Normans had brought rabbits over with them when they did their own invasion, and now we're finding out actually about 1,000 years before that were rabbits already here because of the Romans. It's not a massive discovery in the grand scheme of things, I suppose, but it is a fascinating part of our history that we didn't previously know.
I love this. How did bunnies change history?
Well, yeah, that's it.
I wish we'd known this before we did History's Greatest Animal down the pub, because I'd have gone for the Roman bunny.
I'd still have won.
Oh, you stupid bear. Anyway, do you know what? I'm going to switch the next two questions around because I desperately want to ask you this one, because my abiding memory of my visits to Fishbourne Roman Palace are the epic mosaics. That's the standout feature, isn't it?
Well, yes, that's it. Of all of the artefacts found there, the mosaics are they're the crown jewel of the site, effectively. I mean, they've uncovered evidence of more than or as many as 50 very elaborate mosaics, which it makes up the largest collection of in situ mosaics in the UK.
The only thing I've ever seen comparable to it is what's it called in Spain, beginning with I, in Andalusia.
Yes, I can't think of the name actually either, but
yeah, it's the only thing I've ever seen where you can literally, you're walking around the site and it's like, oh, another amazing mosaic.
Yeah, I mean the mosaics themselves, they're not as necessarily well done as some that have come from later houses, later villas even within Britain, but they're, with the sheer number of them and the designs and everything, we're seeing indications of the fashions of the time almost. And it's unlikely that native Britons had formed these mosaics. It was unlikely that native Britons had built the proto-palace or the palace itself. It was most likely builders imported from Italy. I say imported. Builders come over from Italy. And
Italica, that's what it's called.
Yes.
Near Seville, for that exact reason. I just remembered as you said the word Italy.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, several of the mosaics had been built over each other, and some had been discovered when restoration work was carried out on some of them. So they've lifted them up to restore them and make sure that they're going to be able to survive for another generation to see them. And older ones were discovered underneath. And we've got indications that some of the earliest have got the geometric patterns, just monochromatic black and white tiles weaved into various shapes, but more elaborate and complex designs soon replacing them. Probably the most famous of this being the Cupid on a Dolphin mosaic, which was laid down around about the mid-2nd century, with the central image of, as pretty much described, Cupid on a dolphin. And around the four sides, you've got these semicircular panels with seahorses and what's been described as sea panthers, because if you're going to deal with mythological creatures, why not? And the corners, you've got shells with the borders of interlaced ribbons and tendrils. And as I say, the imagery itself in this one particularly, it's exceptional. It's got this suggestion of movement, but later mosaics that we find in British villas show how it had, how the designs had moved on, so to speak, how they became more realistic and more precise. So they're not by any means they're not the greatest mosaics necessarily in of themselves, but it's more the sheer collection that we've got there is more complete than anywhere else within the UK. And they also show us as well, the mosaics show us some of the damage over time. I mean, you might have noticed from your visits there, some of the holes, these sort of circular and square holes where poles from later structures had been pierced through them. There's plough lines going through them, and obviously the rather notable line through several of them from where the digger had unearthed the site itself. So we can also see how the site itself had also been used over time as well. So there's that hint to later history.
I've got to say, mosaics are probably my most favourite thing that is excavated on any Roman. It's just they're so some of these are so detailed. I mean, my favourite of all time is got to be the Alexander mosaic by far.
Yes.
But nevertheless, you're looking at some of these details and how big these they were. I mean, how long did it take? If it was one artist, two artists, 10 or 20 artists, however many, to put together this grand piece of artwork.
Not only that, but for a kid from London as well, the fact that this is quintessential Roman Empire on a day trip from London. You don't have to be able to get your kids to Rome to show them. It's a brilliant site, and it's so underknown. Every time someone says to me, like, oh, you're into history, like, it's something I do as a hobby. Where can I take my kids to entertain them? I always tell them about Fishbourne. Always.
Oh, definitely. I mean, as you say, the mosaic, you think Romans, you think mosaic. It's the two are virtually inseparable, and it is amazing. Tiny rocks forming these elaborate images. I mean,
yeah.
Even
Elena, you would love the birds at Italica. There's a room where there's masses of different birds.
Do you know, that reminds me of the one in Caesarea in Israel, where Gilad took me to look at this mosaic that nobody really goes and sees. It's just outside Caesarea, the ancient city, and it's just absolutely stunning.
Apart from mosaics, do we know anything more about how they decorated this in this villa?
Yeah, so we've got quite a bit, as I say. So we've gone through sort of a layout of the site itself and the gardens, which would have formed quite a large sort of part of the impression. Any visitors to the palace would have had to have gone through the gardens. So you've got this impression in the gardens itself of creating the image of power that the individual had, the richness and everything else like that from just the gardens. But then you enter into the building itself, and we know that the walls, and it's highly likely the ceilings as well, would have been quite elaborately painted and decorated. Again, this scale and grandeur. You're creating this image of somebody important. If you were going to ask him for a favor, you needed to know who you were asking for a favor from. Taxes, things like that. This was the guy who had the full authority of the Empire of Rome behind him. So you had these elaborately painted walls and ceilings. And whilst little of the wall plaster itself survives in position, excavations revealed enough fragments to tell us that the style of decoration was sort of an imitation of very elaborate inlaid marble. So they had effectively painted marble. Each room would have had a mock marble dado up to about 1 metre off the floor, and cornice moulding would have been then above that. So you've got this kind of like a skirting board, effectively, effect. And above this, then you'd have had the main wall panels with either this mock marble effect framed with various other stones, or perhaps delicately painted flowers scenes. There's one famous one that they found which shows the corner of a building with the sea in the background, sort of painted on this wall panel. And the doors themselves would also have been framed with marble imported from Turkey, or Purbeck marble, with the Turkish marble usually forming the top and the Purbeck marble along the sides. And there's also indications of Pyrenean marble being used as wall decoration. And some of the rooms had decorated friezes of moulded stucco with birds holding fruits in their beaks, bowls of fruits, or the simple egg and darts style of moulding. What's interesting about this is stucco itself is very rare in Britain. It doesn't appear to have been widely used for decoration, and Fishbourne is the only known example of this kind in the country. So again, we've got this indication of such a unique site that it must have been. And it's likely that it had various marble and bronze works of art, but little evidence of this remains. We do have a marble head that was found, dated to late 1st century, which some have identified this as being the Emperor Nero, aged around 13, around about the time he was adopted. But others suggest that it wasn't Nero, it could have been the son of the owner.
Are there any written sources found about the palace?
So there's no ancient sources I know of that directly reference the palace. Part of the whole, we'd lost it for such a large number of years, possibly indicated by that. But there's a number of modern publications, several by Professor Cunliffe, for example, exploring the possible history of the palace, various theories that surround it. As mentioned before, we do have the inscriptions, which hint at the possible owners and various important men from the inscriptions found at Chichester that may have been once inhabited the place, but there's no sort of ancient sources that directly reference it.
Did you do part of your work on it was to compare, wasn't it, archaeological evidence versus written evidence? Did you take Fishbourne into account for that?
So it formed the basis of the of the assignment that I did, mainly looking at the problems with the ownership and how we used the inscription evidence along with what had been found at the site to sort of tie in who may have owned Fishbourne. As I say, it's a puzzle that it's unlikely, unless we do unearth a source that directly attributes the place to it, to a particular owner. It's unlikely we'll ever fully know. It's obvious from the site that it was used for governance of the area, at the very least, if not for Britannia as a whole, especially in early years. As I say, when you were walking through to petition the governor, effectively, you would have passed through this impression of power. And so it was looking at that, sort of tying everything in, who actually owned Fishbourne Palace. And it's one of those where we've looked at the archaeological evidence, we've looked at what little written evidence is, mostly those inscriptions. We still don't know, but we've got a very good educated guess as to who owns it. And the main problem with that assignment is it was such a short assignment. I think I had 1,000 words to discuss such a complex subject.
Oh, wow.
But the idea of obviously working on brevity, which is something I could continue to work on.
We love 1,000-word essays. It's like, here's this lovely, beautiful topic. Write it in 1,000 words.
Mate, I can't even do an introduction in 1,000 words anymore. I've been spoiled.
Well, that was one of the pickup points, actually, I got back from my tutor on that assignment. She turned around and said that at the end she felt like I had more to say. And
no shit.
I'm looking at it thinking, yeah, quite possibly I did, because it's such a large subject. Oh yes, it's a skill I'm still working on. As I say, I could probably work on my brevity for a long time, and both in written and speaking work sometimes.
So can you tell our listeners how they can get to the palace and any other useful details that they might need?
So it's located, as I say, just outside Chichester, which is in West Sussex in southeast England. It's just off of the main road leading to Chichester, from my way, the A32, I think it is. But it's fairly easy. It's well signposted in the area. As I mentioned earlier, current restrictions, unfortunately, I believe it is still closed. But I would suggest keeping an eye on the web page. Look for Sussex Archaeological Society. It's one of the sites that they manage, and it's definitely worth visiting. I mean, for additional information, if nothing else, just to see the mosaics in person. The museum has a full collection of artifacts that you won't necessarily be able to get hands-on with, but you'll be able to see all these various artifacts. They've got a breakdown of the Roman invasion of Britain, a mock-up of how the palace would have looked at the time it was built, and they do some hands-on. So there's a fantastic roof tile that they pass around, and if you turn it over, there's a cat's paw prints where the cat had obviously walked across it while it was drying. So again, just that little bit of history that sort of makes it a bit more real, as opposed to pages in a book. And the fantastic work they've done at building up the portion of the garden they've got available to them, it's definitely worth a visit. With many sites at the moment, many historical sites and zoos, things like that are struggling, I do recommend, as soon as you get the chance, to flood them with visitors, obviously keeping safe in the meantime. But these sites definitely need visitors as soon as they can.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about Fishbourne Roman Palace as a location and about your passion for the site, and to basically sell it to people, because you really should go, guys. It's so easy to get to, and it is such a magnificent site, and it's right on our doorsteps in the southeast of England, and not enough people know about it. So thank you very much for coming on to share that with us.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
Join us tomorrow when Colin Fisher will be with us to talk all about Guernica. Alina has been dying to do this podcast, and as usual, he's brilliant, so don't miss that. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack, and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. There's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.